Constructed Criticism is brought to you by our three amazing sponsors, Grey Viking Games, Oasis Games, and PureMTGO.com. You can find them directly in the links in the show notes and use the codes associated with each sponsor. We appreciate each of them and definitely think that you should check them out for all your Magic the Gathering needs. Now sit back and enjoy this week's episode of Constructed Criticism.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 380th episode of Constructed Criticism. I am your dashing host, Mason, joined by my suited up co-host, Abe. Abe, how you doing?
I was wondering if you were starting with dashing. I thought it was a Ragavan joke, and I'm glad I got it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're so... Give me a minute. Trying to think of a play on words with smart and hammer. Smart enough to know to play hammer instead of me person. So obviously you're going to get that joke or whatever. And I'm so glad you're able to do that. That was awesome. Spencer is unfortunately sick this week of the show. So it's just going to be me and Abe. And with Spencer not here to stop us from talking about Modern, we're diving all the way in from Modern. We know that the fake GP Vegas is coming up very soon, and that's going to be... I mean, it's not a GP, right? Like, I don't know, I'm going to this event. Like, it is a GP, except it's not called GP Vegas. So, essentially, GP Vegas is coming up. If you're playing in the Cersei Games Invitational, we're going to one of the events there in Roanoke. There's a big Modern there, and Modern's always popping on Arena. And, as we'll mention later, we haven't talked about Modern since about week 2 or 3 of MH2 coming out. So, we have a lot of really exciting things to talk about for Modern on this week, and we're going to really dive into that. But first, we do need to do Always Improving. It is the point of the show. And Abe, what was your Always Improving moment this week?
So my Always Improving moment this week had a bit to do with the Arena Open. And for those of you wonderful listeners who follow me on Twitter, you would have seen me kind of post that I didn't have the best go of things. I reached 6 wins many times on many attempts. But ultimately, I played like 8 win-ins for day 2 and lost all of them and kind of gave up. And... So I was on the sidelines for Sunday. I was watching my friend Kane stream his day 2, and something he did that I thought was really smart that I hadn't thought about at all during day 1 was that when you play Magic in paper or you play Magic on Magic Online, there's kind of this natural built-in downtime between rounds. You get to decompress, and I wasn't really giving myself that time when I was playing my Arena Open Day ones. And I wonder how that affected my my ability to make, all my best decisions. I was playing White Weenie for the day 1 portion in Best of 1, and I was really just like kind of getting through games in a blur. I wanted to get done as fast as possible, and that probably wasn't the best of, way for me to go about it, and wasn't the best way for me to ensure I was playing my best the whole way through. There's a lot to think about in, we are people, and it's definitely different playing on Arena than it is playing in person with the amount of time you have. So giving yourself time to decompress, even if it takes some restraint, because you do want to just get in there and, be on a roll, play your matches, and just win. You want to just keep on hitting Q because you want to play the matches. It can be very valuable to give yourself a minute to breathe and decompress, and, the fact that I lost so many of these matches were all when I was already at 6 wins tells me that maybe there was something going on internally. I was putting a lot of pressure on myself that I could have just taken some time, taken a deep breath, taken a walk around my neighborhood or whatever, gotten some fresh air, and then come back and played and been more refreshed and more removed from the emotional situation, especially after losing so many times previously. So something to think about when it comes to the way that I play Arena and just in general when I play Magic. Giving myself time to decompress is my Always Improving this week.
Yeah, I think that's super important. Right? We actually had a whole episode, I think a long time ago, about what do you do at a GP or whatever, and it was a pretty big divide among us, those of us that played games and dig stuff, and those of us that just kind of went around and talked or listened to music, or the last thing we want to do is play a game, or whatever. So it's good to know that sort of for your person. So I'm glad that you're awesome, ready to go. And don't worry, if Cersei Games is anything like they used to be at the Invitational, we're going to have plenty of time between rounds. It's going to be awesome. We're going to be wait, why did we want this again? It's 40 minutes over. How's this happening? Anyways, my Always Improving moment from this week actually also came from the past weekend. I played a lot of Modern in person. So I played like a little local 1K. I played my local window box thing. And when playing those, the always improvement really came from critically like challenging my sideboarding stuff and thinking about what my opponent will be doing for me, like what their plans are, and kind of where they're at with the format and kind of judging that. And so what I mean by that is there are things that are like kind of accepted knowledge or whatever in certain areas and certain kind of thought process in like circles, but not everyone always thinks that way, and sometimes they come to maybe incorrect conclusions. So I think the specific game that really sparked this for me and made me think about it was I was playing a Murktide Mirror Abe, and my opponent was playing Jeskai Murktide. And when we finished game one, we had a very nice, good rapport the whole time we were talking, and he's like, yeah, I was actually playing that deck a bunch, and I really liked it, but I just kept losing to Chalice of the Void, so I needed, like, an answer to that, and they put Prismatic Ending in their deck, right? And so that made me, and like I have EE as my answer, right? But like they clearly don't have EE, so like that kind of tells me something like, hey, my opponent's not gonna have EE. I don't think we really have it in the mirrors, but that's fine. So something to be aware of. But what it did make me do is like, okay, if my thought process is I'm really weak to Chalice and I'm in white and I have Prismatic Ending, are there cards that I would have as the Murktide deck to maybe gain another edge against that sort of card and that sort of thing? And it made me come to the conclusion that they might have to Fairy 3 in their deck. And so I was like, okay, they could have one or two copies in the main, maybe some on the board. And I think this is a reasonable enough thing and a strong enough card in the mirrors. If you're playing against blue-white as Murktide, you'll know that getting your Murktide unsummoned is brutal. I can only imagine if they had their own Murktide what that's like. And so I actually left in a Spell Pierce when normally like that's kind of a card that I would trim for a Fluster Storm. I kind of moved my cards around in a different way to have an answer to that. And I think that was really helpful. And I kind of did that a bunch over the course of the weekend where like I played against a Prowess opponent who's playing like an older Prowess build. I was kind of thinking about like, okay, what kind of cards would they have? Because I like kind of stomped them game one, and then she was like, gonna get my sideboard out, and she like kind of grabbed 4 cards and kind of slammed them down, right? And the conclusion I came to was that like, oh, it might actually just be Leyline of the Void. And, the answer to that is I have Ragavan with treasure tokens, so I have EE, so it's not a problem. But, like, it got me thinking, like, okay, is there something else I should be doing to have this sort of answer, And I think thinking about that sort of stuff is really important. Thinking about, like, okay, what is your opponent doing? Are they playing in ways that, like, maybe show that they approach the matchup differently than you? Is that right or wrong as a post-match reflection? But in match, in the moment, you need to do what you think is best. And it's like, okay, how can I leverage this information? If my opponent thinks that Ragavan is like a card they should be sideboarding out in the mirror, then I should be like leveraging that knowledge. And so I should like try to stick to Dragmans early because they think it doesn't matter. And that sort of stuff kind of came up a bunch this weekend. So that was my always improving moment.
Yeah, it's really important to, games are dynamic things where each player's actions really impact things. And so knowing how to deviate from that, like, what you're used to or what you usually evaluate things as, because what you think the opponent's going to do is when you get a sense that they're thinking about something different is really, really important. I think that's a really, really good lesson to take away and something to always be thinking about. Comes up a lot with like people talk about sideboard guides. A sideboard guide is just a like it's a map to maybe where you're trying to go, but it's not. It's not the route. It's just showing you kind of where you want to end up to picture the place you want to be, not necessarily the Bible on how to do things, and sometimes you need to deviate from that.
Yeah. If you looked at a Lewis and Clark map, you could probably get to California from wherever you are in the United States from the East Coast, but you might want to use your actual GPS, which is your brain, and use it in the moment. Did you like that one, Abe? Did you like that analogy? I saw you look up, like, where's he going with this?
Lewis and Clark, like, did they ever make it to California? Is that a thing?
Well, they got you pretty close. they made it pretty far. That's my ancestor you're talking about. So let's be chill. Let's just all chill. Let's just chill.
All right. Yeah, we're chilling.
I actually don't know if they're my ancestor. I just say that sometimes. I don't know. I couldn't lie to you. The honesty had to come out. Anyways, Modern. We're going to talk all about Modern this week. Let's hop right into it because Modern is a big format. It's been a while since we talked about it, and we have a lot to talk about today. So, Abe, to catch the listeners up, if you've been listening to CC constantly since the last time we talked about Modern, you will know that as Miranda decks were on the rise in Modern, they were all over the place. There was a bunch of different shells. It was looking super promising. We saw Enchantress be everywhere. We saw Murktide decks and Hammer decks. And nowadays, what are we kind of seeing as like the top echelons of the metagame? Are we still cooking in the kitchen, or was it too hot?
It was too hot for Asmo in the kitchen, unfortunately. I was a big believer in that, like, some variant of that deck and that shell was going to be like the most busted thing, and it was going to be like, we got to do something about this. But as it turned out, as the format had more pressure put on it, as the best parts of the Asmo deck were identified, and also its weaknesses were identified, it kind of fell by the wayside. And honestly, of the handful of decks we talked about initially, I think none of them look that similar to where they were initially, except for maybe Blue Red Murktide. I think that was probably the closest off the bat. But like Hammer Time has gone from a mono white deck to now kind of a white black deck, splashing for more interactive spells as people have started playing more interaction that really matters for Hammer Time. The Rhinos deck has gotten more tuned towards the things that are happening in the format. Like, I think the original Rhinos lists, no one was playing cards like Fury. It was a lot more cryptic commands. Yeah, like a lot of people were playing a bunch of cryptic commands and Jaces and stuff, and that's kind of, they've gone the way of more interaction. So the format has definitely changed quite a bit, even if some of the decks are the same. And it's been really cool to see it evolve.
Yeah, so let's kind of just hop right in. I think the best way to kind of do this, Abe, as we were talking before, is like, let's kind of lay the groundwork and let's talk about what we think are probably like the 4/5 kind of default best decks in the format. So it really gives us a groundwork, and then we're going to go over some of the results from this past weekend and talk about some other decks in the format. And I think you and I think, are both in agreement of this, that Hammer Time is the best deck in Modern right now. I don't know how you feel about it. I feel that it's not quite close. I think it is close enough in theory, but if I had to tell someone, I would tell them it's not close, and that they should just put the time into Hammer Time. I think that deck is quite good. Would you agree with that statement before we dive deep into this deck?
Yeah, as someone who is really, really high on Hammer Time, I play it a ton. It's like the deck that I've fallen in love with in Modern right now. I would say that I think that the format has done a really good job of adapting to the pressure put on it, but there was a solid few months where Hammer Time had the work put into it. The deck lists became really solid, and like, people were not prepared. They did not have the kinds of cards you needed to actually interact with the deck. Well, I think that's changed now. I think that we'll see as we look over some of the events over the past weekend. There were two qualifiers that were a big deal happening on Magic Online. So there's a lot of results to look at, especially leading up to the Grand Prix in Vegas, the quote unquote Grand Prix in Vegas, and the Invitational. But I think Hammer Time it's kind of like Affinity used to be a long time ago, where it was like this deck that you always had to respect. It could always show up and win in a competent pilot's hands. It has draws that are kind of unbeatable. And you have to be ready to interact with it, although it's a little harder to get around. It's kind of in that hybrid between Affinity and Infect at being the best proactive deck you could play, I think. So I don't have any anything else to say there. I think that it is a really solid choice and one of the best decks, and it's not going to be dethroned anytime soon.
Yeah, I think the Hammer Time deck is incredibly skill testing, incredibly powerful, and also gives you free wins so much that, like, it reminds me of the old Amulet Titan thing that people would say, where the more time you put into Amulet, the more it will give you, right? Like, if you invest a bunch of time in Amulet, the results will come. And we saw this with Edgar Dilks, Will Pulliam on the SCG Tour, just dominating in the early 2019, late 2020 era, just playing Amulet all the time. I think Hammer Time is that right now when it comes to, like, being the best deck or whatever. And the more time you put into Hammer, the better you get the small decisions. And, I mean, like, it's so funny. I think the deck's really hard to play, and the more you think about it, the harder it gets, because your decisions are so close. You have so many options all the time. And I remember playing my first league, I just didn't really think about things and just, like, tried to, like, max hammering people on 2 or 3 or whatever. And like 4-1, I'm like, oh, this deck's, like, obviously I understood it was hard or whatever. Like, I knew I got kind of lucky in my game, so I was like, this isn't that bad. And then actually trying to test it for the invitation, I'm like, wow, this deck is really, really skill testing. And if I thought this was, like, a skill I had that I was good at, I would be over the moon about. And I also think that, like, if I could put a bunch of time to this, I could get a lot of rewards out of it. So if you're looking for that sort of thing to test and get ready for, you can turn the podcast off now. This is the deck to do that for. we got your click on Spotify. We're good. Make sure to check out our Patreon. Either way, I think the deck is really good. And before we move on to the other decks, I want to hit you with my hot take on Hammer. Are you ready? It's the Splinter Twin of the format. Splinter Twin was a reactive deck that had a combo kill. This is a proactive deck, so it's not as punishing. Like, I think when a reactive combo deck has it, it's a lot harder on people. But this sort of deck is like, puts a lot of stress on you to like make good blocks, make good decisions, hold your mana up, and like Thalia's you in a very similar way that like Dismember would in the Splinter Twin deck, where you kind of always have to have that mana up in case they go for the hammer on a creature. Because the trick is actually that there's not much of Modern that kills a creature once it gets +10/+10. So once you get the hammer on there, you're either abyssing them or you're killing them. There's no in between, really.
Yeah.
So do you think that's like an absurd statement? Do you think that's
No, I think that's pretty. I think that, you know, something that made Twin so good was that it was this deck that kind of leveraged the implication that it could win the game at any moment, and used a lot of these reactive elements in like Bolt and Snapcast Mage. They're really good at policing the format to like work its way into winning positions, and kind of that's what made it a little too like cumbersome to play against or unfair. And this is kind of a similar thing, but like, you know, sometimes you're so worried about the hammer that you just lose to the Urza Sagas and stuff in play, you know, and or like, you know, your opponent like didn't actually have it all. They didn't have the Shadow Spear and the hammer. They weren't set up for it, but because you gave them the time and they were like, you know, kind of making you worry about it, now they've had the time to find a Stoneforge for a hammer, and actually you couldn't beat the hammer the whole time because they had this other thing or whatever. The deck is incredibly good at its game plan, and that game plan can be really diverse. So I think that's a little bit of a hot take, because I think anytime you say Splinter Twin and Modern in the same sentence, it's a hot take, but I don't think it's that far out of reality. I like it.
Word. All right. Well, it is. So it's not really. It's more of the people aren't ready for the take, more so than it's a hot take. But I'm glad you're in the kitchen with me. Let's talk about Blue Red Murktide real quick, because this is the deck that when we last talked about was it was kind of on the up and up. I think at the time there, you know, we mentioned Asmorin and stuff. That was more getting the spotlight. But this deck was popping up like, hey, these Murktides are 7 tower, 7 toughness. Asmorin can't kill them. What's happening? And this deck has sort of become the like default blue-red interactive, like, I'm going to tempo you out sort of thing, or like grind you out into the dirt, that these people always used to want to play in Modern, and hasn't really been playable until now, I would argue, in any form except for maybe Arclight Phoenix, which is a very different sort of thing. But what do you think about Blue-Red Murktide going into this format?
Yeah, I mean, even if you look at the early list of Blue-Red Murktide, they I think literally had Delver Secrets in them, which is like a card people were always wanting to play in Modern. And now they've moved away from it for just playing their Dragon Mace Channelers and Ragavans. But I think that this is probably the only like black stain on this deck's record, or you know, the only like thing that knocks it down is that its hammer matchup isn't that great. But I think that this is the kind of deck that, similarly to hammer, rewards you for putting in a bunch of time and a bunch of effort into understanding it and knowing all the little things and the nuance. And it's like kind of like the new Jund in some people's hearts, where it's a deck where, you know, you can always just play. I can always play Murktide. You know, if I don't find anything I really like, if I have a good Murktide list, I'm probably not, you know, it's your 45%er deck. It's like I'm probably not worse than 45% in anything, and I'm coin flipping a bunch of my other matchups, or I'm favored. So, you know, I think it's a deck that shows kind of why Counterspell is a little. It's funny, people were like, oh, put Counterspell in Modern, Control needs to be better, but this is the kind of deck that Counterspell actually enables, right? Like, the fact that you can counter any spell, like, in your tempo deck matters a ton when you're trying to fight over these 1-mana, like, permanents like Ragavan and DRC. And it's really funny that I think no one really thought about that, but the fact that it's come together has been really, I think, beautiful for the format, and the deck's really, really sick.
Yeah, this is the deck I've been putting the most time into, and I've put probably the most time into Modern since its release in the MH2 kind of era. And everything I think Abe said there is super true, except like, instead of your like Jund like being like, oh, I really hope no one shows up with a combo deck or whatever, your only thing you're scared of is really hammer, and like the combo decks are super easy. So it's great in that aspect. I love that part of it. But the one thing that we didn't mention, I think the thing that actually puts this deck, like, I think if we didn't have this card, this deck would still be good, but it wouldn't be as good, and that's Expressive Iteration. Expressive Iteration from Strixhaven has totally changed how like this deck's allowed to play. And essentially, you have this 2-mana card that you play in the mid game a lot of the time that gives you this burst of selection and cards. And with the way your deck's constructed normally, that sort of burst overwhelms a lot of the other decks. And your deck's really good at kind of trading off resources, pulling slightly ahead, and then jamming an expressive iteration and just totally taking over the game. And I was talking to someone who actually was another blue-red Murktide player from our local store, and I was telling him how we played the mirror, and I won. I 2-0'd him, and he kept playing his expressive on 3. Because he was like, I want to hit my land or whatever. I want to like curve out. And I asked him, I was like, did you have a land drop or whatever to play already? And he was like, yeah. And I was like, well, I think you should hold that card because the longer you hold that card, the more powerful it gets. A lot like if you played Legacy Brainstorm. Like you try to wait on casting Brainstorm so you kind of know what you're looking for. You can kind of sculpt a better game plan. Expressive Iteration is the exact same thing. You'll fire it off on 3 if you need your lands or you need some gas or you're just kind of floundering. We got an excess of them. But you really want to be like, holding it, and I played the Blue-Red Murktide matchup a bunch this weekend, and there were multiple games where I had it in my hand starting on turn 3. I was ahead the whole time and won the game with it in my hand because it was just like, yeah, if my opponent ever finds a way to get ahead, I'm going to counter back with this expressive iteration, and I'm going to end the game. Like I'm either going to move through 3 lands or whatever, or I'm going to find some stuff they can't beat. And I think the Murktide deck has a big strength in that area, and its sideboard I think is super beneficial. And that's the one small thing that's changed in Murktide is there's this debate going on, Abe, about Consider versus Thought Scour. And that's been like kind of the only big change in Murktide since we last talked about it.
Yeah.
Which is, interesting that there's a lot to be said there. Probably not going to go over that too much today, but if you do want to hear about that, check out Dominar's Judgment. It's a good modern podcast. They've gone over that in detail. Abe, I'm
Team Consider, by the way. I just need to get it out there.
Yeah.
Consider all the way.
Yeah, we can talk about it. I'm also Team Consider, and I had this conversation a bunch this weekend. So I get that Thought Scour is essentially Dark Ritual for the deck, and I think that's really strong. And one of the strengths of the Thought Scour builds is you can turn to a Murktide off a fetch land and another land, or a fetch land bobble will fetch and a Thought Scour. Turn to a Murktide, very strong. A lot of decks cannot beat that. That's for sure. Post board though, your Thought Scours are not as strong as Consider because the way you build your deck in Modern is you'll have these kind of bullets, and being able to actually find the bullet and having some selection is very strong. And the thing that really sold me on it was that, like thinking of it that way. And then once you play one game where you have a DRC in play and you Consider, and it's kind of like Preordain, like not as good as Preordain, right? Like if you look at 2 at once, it's much better than look, and draw. But you just start moving really quickly, and it's like, all right, well, the only thing that matters in this matchup is me finding my one dress down or whatever. So I'm going to try and find this dress down. I'm going to try and find this Alpine Moon. And you get a lot of selection in your cards and a lot of ways you can sculpt your game plans. And I think that's really strong. And I think in the mirrors, outside actually of just slamming Murktides, the Consider is actually better in the head-to-head because you get to find your expressive iterations, which is the most important card outside of the threats. So that's the TLDR. There are good reasons to play Thought Scour, of course, and there are cards you can play along with Thought Scour to make it better. But if you want to build your sideboard with Silver Bullets, I highly suggest trying the Consider deck. Anyways, let's run over that and get on to Rhinos. This is kind of funny. We mentioned it kind of in passing when we were reviewing the old decks. I was much lower on this deck back then than I am now, but Rhinos is a deck that burst onto the scene with MH2. And people were like, I got all these Cascade spells and these Rhinos in interaction, and this deck's sweet. And that deck really reminded me of kind of like a futuristic Jund deck, right, Abe? Like, I'm going to kind of trade on interaction. I have a couple swing cards. And instead of them being like Liliana swing cards, it's kind of like, lol, I have Rhinos. And the Rhino deck has gone through some crazy iterations from like playing Teferis because it was the most popular deck, and so people want an edge in the mirror, to like now we're kind of a super mid-rangey deck with like Dead Gone, Fire Ice, Fury, Brazen Bar, Bone Crusher Giant, all in the main deck, and just kind of like this. It's clunky-esque mid-range deck with this powerful Rhino draw to it. What do you think about Rhino in the metagame right now?
Yeah, I think that before Rhinos was kind of this control deck that was awkwardly trying to make the Cascade thing work, but now it seems more like it has a lot more cohesion. It's playing just a bunch of interaction to get to the point where it can Rhino and then win with its 2/4/4s, which is a lot better. I think it's like I think that also as the format overall has kind of leaned down and pushed the games down closer. Like they've made the game shorter by making their decks better. This deck has responded in kind, and also it makes it so that putting that much pressure in play, like an end of turn violent outburst into 2 Rhinos, putting the shields down for such a small time and then untapping with all of the interaction again. I think that is a much better play pattern now than it was earlier. I was really low on this deck like early on in the format because of people were doing things that were so much more powerful. And like I was beating Rhinos players regularly by being like, yeah, I just don't care about your 2/4/4s. I'll just like win with my stuff that's stronger. But as the stronger stuff has gotten worse, I think the Rhinos deck has gotten better. And so, it is a very, I think it's kind of like a blue Jund kind of situation where a lot of your cards are either just efficient answers, and then you've got this like Bloodbraid into Tarmogoyf or whatever at any time. You get to choose when you're putting the shields down, and that's your hammer that swings the game ahead for you. And I think it's a really solid choice. I still haven't played a ton of it recently, and I don't think I really get it. It's not like the deck that I like to play or something. I've like played a league or two with it, but it hasn't really impressed me. But it does put up a lot of results, and I think that there is definitely good theory behind what's going on there, and the deck is certainly certainly a huge part of the metagame. So
yeah, it's definitely comes out in force. It's funny, like my original take, and I remember talking to people about this. Like we went to like a 2K or whatever when the set first dropped, and it's like the deck's so clunky and it barely plays in the first 2 turns of the game, and the first 2 turns of Modern have always mattered. And while all the answers that are around in Modern have made it so that isn't true, this deck doesn't play those answers. Like you don't have the Prismatic Ending, you don't have the Unholy Heats, the Bolts, and that sort of stuff, and you have kind of these janky versions of that with Fire Ice, Stomp, Brazen Borrower. And while those things get the job done, sometimes they are clunkier, they are a little less powerful. And this deck, I think, really sacrifices a lot in that aspect of the game, but that aspect of the game isn't as needed to be relevant right now because everyone else is doing it for you. And the only matchup where you kind of suffer with that is Hammer, but your interaction is actually kind of weirdly good enough against Hammer, like having an unsummon instead of like this tap out like sorcery exile spell and Prismatic Ending really matters, and having Fire, which can like split the damage, really matters. And then you're also the best Force of Vigor deck in Modern, which is a huge point. Like when we talk about Hammer being really good and really strong, that's not like an Abe and Mason thing. That's like everyone in the format basically thinks that. And so you're going to play against Hammer for sure at your events. And so having a deck that gets to play 2 or 3 Force Negations, I'm sorry, Force Negation, Force of Vigor is what I meant. Sorry.
Yeah.
The decks do play Force of Negation as well, which is a big strength, don't get me wrong. But having the Force of Vigor to blow up 2 enchantments or artifacts is so good against that deck. I was actually watching Xwell stream the prelim earlier, and with him playing that, he just got, his opponent had 2 Force of Vigors, and it's just like, oh my gosh, like I cannot actually beat, like, just blow up 2 things to blow up.
Yeah, it's just so much. The cards are worth so much to the Hammer deck that has no way to recoup them, that like that 2-for-1 in the right spots, or even sometimes in the wrong spot still gets you. So
yeah. Yeah, one of them involved blowing up a Springleaf Drum, and it was kind of like a bait Springleaf Drum, and like it worked for like Axel Kruger did the thing and baited them, but they're just kind of like, lol, I have another one, doesn't matter. But even if they didn't have that, they had like a Fury that would have been really bad for him. He was just listing cards that they played. He was like, yeah, Bone Crusher Giant's a nightmare. They kill my thing and then play it, and now if I attack, I have to have this hammer, and blah 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 blah, and all these things. And so, I think the Rhino deck is something that I also don't fully get. Because when I look at the Rhino deck, I think about the next deck we're going to talk about and the previous deck we talk about being in very similar spots as this deck and not being as clunky. But, you do lose some of those more powerful draws, and you do play a lot more cards that actually spend mana, which is kind of upsetting at times. Let's talk about Saga Jund real quick. So Jund, since we've last talked about it, looked like it had died off before, but has since been saved by Magic Saviors, the Zoomers. The Zoomers went in, they cut every card that costs more than 3 mana. Like, even the Kolaghan's commands are gone now. They've cut them all. Maybe you have 1 Kolaghan's command if you're lucky. But you cut them all, and you just play, like, 30 1-drop interactive spells and threats. You can play 4 Tarmogoyfs, and you got, like, an Abrupt Decay flex spot. And that's your deck. And it's all the cards you would think. Like, if you just, like, if I told you that, you're like, yeah, like, Fatal Push, Thoughtseize, Lightning Bolt, Unholy Heat, DRC, Ragavan. Yeah, that's just the deck. with Urza Saga as a way to go find the bullet artifacts that you're also thinking of. Bauble, Shadow Spear, Nihil Spellbomb, Pithing Needle. You find those things, and you're just the new Jund deck that has kind of always existed, except now all your cards are cheap and not clunky. And Abe, I love this deck. It is not as good as Murktide. I've never been a huge Jund fan or a Jund guy, but wow, this deck, it really takes the idea of being mana efficient and the impact of your spells actually mattering at all points, and takes that to the extremes and plays a bunch of broken cards in the form of Ragavan, DRC, Urza Saga, Lurrus, and
Ren and 6.
And Ren, yeah, sorry, the deck plays Ren and 6. I forgot about that. Yeah. And so I mean, the deck is so strong.
Yeah, that deck I think is probably one of the coolest evolutions of the format that there's been, where like just there were these red-black Ragavan decks kind of playing Kroxa, maybe playing Mardu to play Prismatic Ending to answer some specific things. But this deck just said, like, Jund cards are good, and we're going to play these Ren and 6s and Saga, because that together is a great way to really outgrind anything, and you just get to tutor up so many of these bullets out of your main deck that it gives you the long game grind that you really need to operate as this kind of one-for-one interaction deck. And yeah, it really impressed me. I'm not a Jund guy at all. I've been very open about this in the past. But I have played, a handful of leagues with the deck to make sure that, especially for the Invitational, that I wasn't like leaving any stones unturned. And it was really impressive. Like, I was not expecting it to be so good, but something about all of your spells, especially the discard spells, being so strong and backed up by so much, where you didn't need, there's no Raging Ravines out here. You don't need a bunch of, you don't need your last thing to be this like, oh, now I'm at 5 mana and I can kill you with my last thing. It's like, no, I'm just gonna, Thoughtseize you, kill your next thing, maybe to play a threat. Maybe I'm just waiting and playing this Saga and then leaving up all my mana all the time, making a couple tokens, getting a Shadow Spear. Now I've got 5 or 6 power in play. Your move is really tough for a lot of the decks in the format, and it grinds really well. Magic's future is in good hands. This deck is something that I think has really revolutionized. I haven't seen traditional Jund played by anyone but Reed Duke since then. Since the deck started popping up, and it's been really, really impressive.
Yeah, you just don't need those big hammer cards. They actually just aren't as good of hammers as these cheap cards are. And it really shows, and it's really strong. And yeah, like you mentioned, Ren 6 plus Saga is the fair game plan for everyone else who's trying to go bigger. It's like, how much bigger can you really get them? We'll find out over the next couple turns. By the way, I have Lurrus. It's just like, like I also this like saying grindy aspect of my deck. So, yeah, the Jund decks are really, really good. If you've always been a Junder, all hands on deck. Sorry, Liliana the Veil, you're at home, but everything else is ready to go. The last deck before we kind of hop into things is important that we left it off our list like this, because it feels like it's been that way always, and it's been good. We even mentioned it in the last episode in passing, but we didn't go over too much, and that's the Living End deck. This blue Living End deck has consistently performed since MH2 came out. It hasn't changed that much. It's just adapted to what's going on. It is very, very strong and is just a real player in the metagame and never gets the respect. Almost always puts up at least a top 16. And one of the I believe one of the challenges actually put up 2 top 8s this past weekend, and just kind of taxes people. And I think is like secretly one of the best decks of the format that has this like built up inertia and stigma from the past of being a Living End deck. And it hasn't overcome that because the masses haven't played with enough and content creators haven't pushed it, because it is kind of boring to watch too. Your games all look the same. You cycle, you end a turn living in them, and you have force backup. You're making your force negations into actual forces when you play like that, and that is pretty strong. So it's like the only combo deck. We will go over another combo deck later, but really combo decks have died. It's one of the big changes about Modern in the last little bit, and this is one of the true last combo decks. There's just been too much good interaction printed in the early turns and too efficient threats. Abe, what do you think about the Living End deck?
Yeah, I think that, people talk a lot about how dangerous the pitch spells are to have in Modern, how dangerous it can be to have a free spell that's castable whenever. And I think that this Living End deck really takes that and is using all of these pitch spells in their most unfair application, which means the deck is always going to have a lot of power behind it. Like looking at the lists from the challenge over the weekend, these decks have 4 Grief, which they're able to pitch Street Wraith to, which is a cycler, and Architects of Will to, which is also a blue card and a cycler. So
also the living ends you draw.
Yeah, and the living ends you draw. Yeah, so you have all those black cards. In the sideboard, it has Endurance, which you can pitch your Shardless Agents and Violent Outbursts to if you need to, or you can just cast because you have a good amount of green sources. It's got these Force of Vigors that pitch the same things, and it's using free spells alongside this kind of lights out game plan of I'm going to living end you and have a bunch of things in play, or like, I griefed you once before and now I'm going to living end and grief you again, and like that's probably going to put you too far behind, or I have Force of Negation backup, like you said. And I know for a while that like Wafo Tapo was saying that he thought this was probably the best deck in Modern, although I think he's backed off of that now. This still just shows up quite a bit more than I think people talk about, and is definitely a deck that, if you're someone who likes the kind of gameplay of like, yeah, I'm gonna make you have it, I'm playing a combo deck, or I'm gonna play my combo and back it up. This is the best way to do that, and is definitely one that probably doesn't get all the respect it deserves. I know I pretty aggressively in the past have removed a lot of the graveyard hate from my deck because a lot of these decks are gone, and I think it really capitalizes on that on the weekends where people are just like, yeah, you know what? I don't need all these Nihil spell bombs. I don't need all this junk. I'll just, who's playing graveyard decks?
No one.
And it really deserves the respect. So,
yeah, I agree. I feel like I should do more testing with this deck, and I should like consider it more. But honestly, it's one of those things where you do have to be like down for like, yeah. I mean, if they've got Chalice on 0. You've got like 2 Brazen Borrowers in your main deck, and post board you have cards, but like you kind of got, and you have to be willing to accept that. But if you are willing to accept that, this deck has some really strong draws. It is really resilient for a living end deck, and it's quite good, and you should seriously consider it. And if you're like unsure what to play, and you want to play one of the top 5 decks in Modern, and you're like don't have much time to practice, I would say this is the deck. You're like main game plan will carry enough of the time. You'll just have to figure out some of the finesse spots when the time comes. But all the decks have a lot of finesse spots, so that's fine. That's going to do that for kind of on the big, like, kind of what are the pillars of Modern? What are people thinking about? How does this inform the decisions? Outside of maybe this one next deck that we're about to talk about when we start jumping into the challenges here and the prelims from the past weekend. And that's Blue-White Control. So since we've last talked, Blue-White Control has become a playable deck in Modern. And Abe, this has happened thanks to Yorion and Chalice of the Void and things of that sort of nature kind of really rising up in the metagame. And what's happened is the blue-white decks in the most recent weeks have all adopted either Kahira as a companion or Yorion, and the Yorion decks play a much bigger later in-game plan, and the Kahira decks are kind of more traditional, but they're all Chalice of the Void decks. That has been kind of the big, in my opinion, reason and factor in playing blue-white control. You have all the answers to everything, and you're basically the best E-Tron deck of all time. You're the best Chalice of the Void deck we've had in Modern in so long. You're actually able to answer all the plans, and you do kind of just clock them eventually. It's just you use Planeswalkers to reach an instrumental advantage compared to, like, Thought-Knot Seer. Abe, what do you think about blue-white control?
Yeah, I think it was Wafo Tapa who actually was the first one to put Chalice of the Void in his blue-white deck, and since then the archetype has really taken off since he like kind of showed this proof of concept that you could play a deck where Solitude was playing double duty as your way to let your big cards win against like decks like Hammer, where you just have all this really good interaction now, or you can leverage it in a more fair way and just like hard cast it as your winning condition because it has flash, and you can play with a lot of your mana up all the time and be pretty insulated. And Chalice of the Void plays into like beating Rhinos and Living End and a bunch of other decks for free. You get this like free win equity on top of, Solitude is sometimes a free win, or they invest a ton. Fairy's a free win. And you can afford to play Chalice of the Void because you don't play Path Exile anymore, and now you play Prismatic Ending instead. So because of the fact that your 1-mana removal spell isn't turned off by your own Chalice, which is typically like, Eldrazi Tron against blue-white or Jeskai control, historically always was trying to cast Chalice on 1 because it was so good against their best spell in the matchup. But since that's changed and since so much of Modern has changed, this deck I think has really, really, really shown up. I know one of the challenges, it was half of the top 8 was blue-white X control decks. It won one of the 2 PTQs on Magic Online over the weekend, and has really been putting up solid numbers. Like, I think it has a really, really strong matchup against a lot of the format. It plays a lot of the best cards in Prismatic Ending, Counterspell, like you said, Chalice of the Void, but also just has this really, really solid game plan that's very clean. It knows what it wants to be doing. There have also been those Yorion lists. It's kind of either you're a more value-oriented deck where you're trying to go over the top by, maybe you have these Spreading Seas or Wall of Omens or Omen of the Seas, turning your Yorions into even more cards on top, or you're just efficiently 1-for-1ing your opponents with the Kahira deck. But it really makes use of the companion mechanic and just a lot of the best stuff in a way that has moved blue-white control, I guess, like that deck's a 2014 deck, so 7 years into the future. And brought it up to speed into 2021 Magic, and it's been probably the biggest metagame development of the last 6 months or so, is seeing this deck come out in such big numbers and such force to win so many events over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, blue-white control is quite good. I don't have much more to add to it than what Abe said, but it is very, very good. Let's move on to another deck, because we do have a lot of decks we want to talk about here, and that's Burn. That's an oldie but a goodie, has continued to put up results. We've seen the prowess decks kind of fall off over the last couple of months. They just haven't been able to compete with what's going on with MH2 Modern, and honestly, kind of like, why would you play that over other decks like Murktide or Saga Jund? But this is like Eidolon the Great Revel, the stuff you expect from like 2019. You really don't have anything new added to the deck at all. In fact, I'm looking over, and the newest card they play is Rolling Vortex in the sideboard, and it doesn't look like that's stock to play as many, as this deck has 3, but a couple from this past weekend chose to play 3 of them and really seem to have good results. Actually, I'm a liar. Apparently, all the ones I clicked on from the last 2 weeks all have 3 Rolling Vortex. All right, well, one of them did. Anyways, Rolling Vortex, that's all this deck's gained. That and Lurrus, which, by the way, some of these decks don't have Lurrus. I don't remember who it was, but one of the people who top-8'd the Modern challenge from the past weekend with Burn, the Modern prelim, was like, I was an idiot to not play Lurrus in my Burn deck. It's so free, just put Lurrus in your Burn deck. You don't even play Blood Moons in your sideboard. Just please take the free card. It's good in like 1% of your games, and when it's good, it's so good. And you just don't need that many sideboard cards. You don't actually sideboard that much as Burn, despite what every Burn player does. And it's, famous on Twitter today, Matt Sperling, famous quote. He said, I played all these Burn leagues. I kept losing to people who over sideboarded or like missed a few points. What if I played that deck? I don't over sideboard. I know what I'm doing. And, he top-8'd a Pro Tour during it. And I think Burn players could learn a lot from that. But, Abe, what do you think about Burn? I think this deck is great and does a really good job of preying on Hammer and things of that nature. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's the only deck that really just tells the format to race, which I think is, exactly what Burn wants to do. So the interactive decks are all kind of in this arms race with each other, and that leaves a big opening for Burn. There's not a lot of people trying to, gain much life, or people aren't playing so much 1-mana removal, or if they aren't playing much to deal with the inevitability of, I'm going to cast a bunch of lava spikes, and their closing speed isn't that high. So Burn is always a deck you have to respect in Modern. I think there was a while where it was just not in the right spot, didn't have the right sideboard cards, didn't have the right main deck configuration, whatever it was. But as the format has played more to early battlefield creatures, or early creatures on the battlefield, like Ragavan, or like Esper Sentinels, Giver of Runes, Ornithopters, Memnites out of the Hammer deck, Searing Blaze has gotten a lot better, and as blue-white control has gotten better, the general game plan of draw going and casting burn spells has gotten better. So I think that Burn's one of those decks you can't ever get rid of. We kind of saw a little bit of a resurgence of Tron a while ago that has since stopped, but I think this is probably a little stickier than the Tron problem, where you can't just play some sideboard cards that really shut this deck out without sacrificing a ton in other matchups. And, people just like to play burn anyway. A lot of people just like it. I like it. I'm a burn guy. But, it's not a deck that has many weaknesses that are new. It doesn't play any new cards, but doesn't need to. It already had everything it needs. It's got 1 mana, deal 3 damage, and it's going to do that a lot. So yeah, I think that burn is one of those things that just never goes away. I don't know if you have anything more to say about it.
No, I think burn's just quite good. Never goes away, really, and put you to the test if you think it's gone. And it's just one of those decks that a lot of people own. There's a lot of distaste about like having to buy these new MH2 cards for a lot of players. And when they look and they see that this deck puts up results consistently, it's not like it's just a this weekend thing. Burn, much like Living End, is always in the top 16. Probably has a copy in top 8 or in 9th. And just consistently performs and is clearly one of the best decks in Modern. It's just a little weaker and can be targeted if it needs to be hit out, and is harder than people think it is. So you'll always see burn represented because people are like, oh yeah, I own that deck from before the pandemic. I'm going to play that deck. Like, it's already expensive getting out to Vegas, whatever. So expect that sort of thing from people. Speaking of burn, though, let's go with a little deck damage, a little Demir Mill. This deck kind of has been popping in and out of the metagame since we last talked about it. I would say mostly on the outs recently, but it has had some okay finishes recently, including a second place in the challenge this past weekend. Abe, what do you think about Demir Mill?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest draws to the Mill deck, at least in my experience, has been that against all of these Luris decks, Tasha's Hideous Laughter is really, really potent. You will mill a lot of cards for 3 mana, and often, can just hold it for a while. Maybe you cast that Surgical Extraction, that Extirpate. You get to look at your opponent's library and just count it up and say, I resolve this spell, the game ends. And that has been like such a game changer in the way that a lot of Mills matchups have been. I think that, especially on Magic Online, where people kind of respond much quicker in real time, where you start seeing the first Emrakul show up in someone's sideboard to just not lose to Mill, or the first Guy's Blessing, things like that. It tends to fluctuate, but this is definitely a deck where you're playing a bunch of the good removal in the format, the stuff that people are trying to if people are trying to play all these cards that get around Unholy Heat and around Lightning Bolt, because those are the good removal spells, then playing some Fatal Pushes and Drown in the Locks really helps. Really works out well, and but Tasha's Hideous Laughter from Forgotten Realms, I think, is probably the biggest game changer, alongside the fact that people's decks are just a lot cheaper now that they're all incentivized to play Luris.
Yeah, I think those are all really big, things you mentioned. And I think the thing to think about and remember with this deck is not to write off as a joke, kind of like people have done with Living in the past. We mentioned that. This is less so, don't think of it as Demir Mill. Think of it as like a small ball control deck, where it tries to control the game for a short period of time and uses that period of time to mill you out, or set up for like a Tasha into a Tasha turn. Like, I played this deck a little bit because it has a very good hammer matchup. I think Tasha's against a hammer deck is I think their total CMC is 38 Abe, is that right? Something along those lines?
Yeah, it's insanely low.
Yeah, so if they have spells in hand and you mill a couple spells, especially some 2-drops, your Tashas might one-shot them. So, it's something I looked into, and it's not really like a burn deck and that sort of thing. It's just trying to control the game to this one point and then resolve its spells that will quickly end the game. So, I don't love the deck. I think it's a little weak. I think it's a little exploitable, a little narrow. But it has spots where it's secretly broken, and you have to know the weekends on when to pull the trigger. And when you pull the trigger and you play tight, you get hyper rewarded. So the Beer Mill, definitely a thing that'll pop up in the big game here and there. Let's talk about another deck, though, that's kind of been popping up recently that has put up some good results. And we have even some homies playing in the form of Kane, and that's these 4-color mid-range decks. I don't really know what to call them. They're kind of like Omnath piles in a way, but maybe you'll have a better example for a name to call them. But they're really just these value decks that try to ephemerate with Eternal Witness and ephemerate the Solitude in order to get around the sacrifice of the evoke clause. And they're kind of the evolution of the elementals deck, which we saw be a big player for a while, but has since sort of fallen out over the last month. Abe, what do you think about the 4-color mid-rangey decks?
Yeah, I think that it is really hard to say like what one classification for these decks are, but I think that you're right. It is an evolution of elementals from kind of using Risen Reef as its card advantage thing to now some of these decks are playing Eternal Witness as their card advantage thing. There's some decks that are kind of just leveraging Omnath and Bring to Light, but it is kind of just a desire to play with some of the more powerful card advantage spells in the format, some of the more potent threats in the format, like Omnath, like Expressive Iteration, like Ephemerate, alongside some of the pitch elementals to make your deck able to handle like anything and outvalue anything. I think these decks are kind of the more uncharted territory of the format, kind of really pushing the bounds of what you can do. It's just trying to play all of the good spells all under the same roof. And, that's kind of... Omnath is a card that just enables that. And Omnath, we've already seen how powerful it is as a standard card, as a historic card. And that is no different in Modern and Pioneer. So, this is really a deck that I think is playing Omnath the best. These archetypes are all seeking to play Omnath the best. And I think they're all pretty good, but their biggest weakness is that in order to keep up with their hunger for cards, they have to play some cards that lead to some awkward, inefficient draws. You can't just always have, Fury and a red card and an Ephemerate and recoup all of that if you're trying to use your pitch spells to get ahead. And, Elementals used Risen Reef to try to counteract that. That was like one of their best cards. Their best draw engine was to do that with all their stuff going on. This deck does it with Eternal Witness or Icefang Coatl, or some of these decks play Yorion, some don't. Some try to just end the game with Scapeshift. But overall, I just think that these decks are, the mid-range killers. They're going so far over the top and generating so much more card advantage and so many more resources than the rest of the format that it's hard for anything to punish them or to go over them.
Yeah, I agree. We got one last deck I think we should really talk about. It's a bit of a heater. It's Char Belcher. So deck won the last challenge with Char Belcher. What do we think about Char Belcher? Because I'm gonna keep it straight with you, Abe. I do not believe in the Belcher. But
you're not a believer?
I'm not a believer. When the crossroads come, I do not cross them. I continue on my merry way, not playing Belcher. I think the deck has a lot of problems, but he has been playing this deck for a while. Look at Sodek's history. We see him get 9th in that past challenge after winning this one. We see him 5-0 a bunch of leagues. We see him get 9th in the challenge from a week ago. We see him get, I believe, another like top 32 somewhere in the area here. This deck is putting up some results. It did get some big upgrades. It's really the only combo deck in the format that's like truly an all-in combo deck that exists. And it's good because it plays Song of Mad Treachery. So, Abe, what do you think of this deck? I'm not a believer, but...
Would we be talking about this deck if we didn't win the challenge?
Maybe just because Sodek has put up so many ninths, and that's even the reason. It's not even. I would just make that clear. We didn't talk about some of the decks that won the challenge here, or events of last weekend. But Sodek has put up a bunch of ninths, and as you and I both know very well, being in ninth place and being in top 8 is just a little breaker math, and so it's very easily. There's an alternate universe, not much different than ours, where Sodek has put up 3 top 8s in a row and just one, and I think that deserves something talking about. But also, the deck made Blood Moon, which is so funny to me.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm a huge believer in this deck, but it's doing something cool. I do think that a lot of people just kind of stopped exploring the possibilities of the double-faced lands, like modal double-faced cards, when that set came out. I know that Modern was covered in these decks, either using like the Oops All Spells deck, and then using like Thassa's Oracle. These Belcher decks, I think they just really fell off, maybe for a lack of effort being put in, but it does seem that Sodek has certainly been putting in the effort. And that's kind of how I feel about it. I think that there are people putting in the effort. It's probably getting close to being worth playing, but it's not. It's not. It doesn't seem like it's so good that the awkwardness or the probable fragility of it is worth everything else. It doesn't seem like a very good deck to me. Outside of that, but it does seem like it probably has good matchups against a lot of the format right now. I think people are not playing as many force negations as they were maybe a few weeks ago or even a few months ago, because people are playing more of these creatures and more of their threats are creatures than non-creatures, and that probably helps a deck that's trying to resolve Goblin Char Belcher. And there's a bunch of decks playing a bunch of counter spells now, and so playing 4 Veil of Summers in your combo deck is really good. So there's a bunch of metagame factors that feel like they're working in this deck's favor, and that's probably why it's been doing so well, especially as Blue-White has been on the rise. But I'm not sure I have it in me to recommend this deck to anyone for a tournament. I think that it's a little too dicey, a little too flimsy, and it's not what I would want to do. So I don't know. Does that seem in line with what you're feeling, Mason?
Yeah, that's basically a much nicer way of saying what I'm thinking. So I just kind of think there are a lot of good things about this sort of deck, but I wonder, are they so much better than a deck like Living End that is a bit more consistent, a bit more resilient to hate, and has its own hate for hate main deck, which gives you a little game and the sort of type of mirrors and things like that? And is this where you want to be in comparison to that? And my guess is that on the average, the answer is no, but there are positions where this deck is probably slightly better. And so
I do think Strike It Rich is pretty cool. I think that card is being played in the right spot. That's a card from Modern Horizons 2, for people who don't know. Single red, create a treasure token, has flashback for 2 in a red. But like, this is almost Rite of Flame, right? If you're not trying to cast a bunch of spells in the same turn, it is just 1 mana, go up 1 mana. So maybe there is some stuff I'm not really thinking of that makes this deck a lot better than it looks on paper. I'd have to play with it a bit, but it's not something I'm devoting my testing time to or thinking about when it comes to the Invitational, for better or for worse.
Yeah. What's the line on homies in the house losing to this deck, to Belcher? What's the betting line? Not that we'd ever bet on the outcome.
I would set it at we've got 5 people in our Airbnb. I would set it at 0.5 people.
Okay. So you would not say 80%.
I would not.
Okay.
Shout out to Kyle.
Shout out to our homie Kyle. Who, when we were talking about this deck earlier today, our friend said, I think 80% of us are going to lose to this. And it's just like, well, we should be playing Belcher then. Anyways, fun little side story. Abe, that's going to kind of do it when we're talking about all of Modern, kind of about those decks that have been going on. That kind of gives you a pretty good picture. There's a lot of things going on in Modern, so Modern's a huge format. We could talk ad nauseum about this format. But as we're heading out here, and we want to kind of leave the listeners with something, if you were going to be playing a tournament kind of going forward, where would your head be at, and what would you be playing?
So I would definitely be playing Hammer Time. The deck is just one of my favorite decks I've ever played in Modern. I think the experience, both of playing the kind of posturing game with like, am I going to cast my hammer now? The decisions it presents for the opponent, the decisions it presents for me presenting the threats. Really fun, really awesome. There's so many decisions on the table in so many of the games. It's all really intricate, and it feels like it rewards a lot of things I really like in Magic. And sure, people are kind of picking up on playing more Solitudes and more Furies and more of these spells to kind of hate on Hammer, but that just means I'm in the right place in the format. If everyone's trying to do these things to beat me and the deck's still putting up numbers, which it does week in and week out on Magic Online, there has to be something to it, and there has to be. It has to be as good as it looks, and so I'm not really as deterred by the metagame factors that are pushing against it. It really just kind of means that you got to push forward with it. So I've also been playing Hammer for a long time. I've got a good amount of reps under my belt now. But if I was starting from scratch with the Modern format, hadn't really played since the pandemic, and was going to Vegas, I would say start playing as many matches of Hammer Time as you can. Try out as many different builds as you can between now and then, and I think if you really devote yourself to it, you'll certainly be rewarded.
Yeah, I think if you're really good at making a lot of micro decisions and playing things out, then you should play Hammer Time. And I think, not like I mentioned earlier in the podcast, it is the deck that if you put the most time into, it will reward you the most for what you get out of it. But like Abe said earlier, I think Murktide is probably the second deck in that area. And I think when you think about macro, big picture game plans and that sort of thing, and your strength lies there, which I think we're both quite good at both those things, but I think our strengths do lie in the area. And it's funny how this sort of plays out with us. I would suggest you play Murktide. And I think the Murktide deck really does allow you to kind of sculpt towards these end games and these game plans that you want to play. And while you don't have the quite as much free win equity as deck like Hammer, I think Murktide's still quite good. And I think it's also more forgiving than a deck like Hammer is. I think that's something that I value a lot. And I think that I personally will toil over the micro decisions a whole lot and like often come to maybe not even the most optimal, but like the second or third most optimal. And so for me, I'd much rather play a deck like Blue-Red Murktide, where it's still quite good. People still have to respect this sort of deck. It still gets them, and you're much able to sculpt these bigger picture game plans much easier. Not to say that the deck isn't, decision heavy in the early, not to say Hammer isn't the other way. I just feel like that's a good way to big picture look at these decks. And as I just mentioned, that's the way I look at things a lot of the time. And so I believe that you should play one of those two decks. Whichever one of those sound most like you, if you're wanting to play like the best decks in Modern, I would suggest going forward with that sort of stuff. Modern's really sweet right now. It's super interactive. It's kind of the best it's ever been in a lot of ways, even though it's the most unlike Modern it's been in a lot of ways. So I really like the format. I think, Abe, you do as well. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a far cry from where we were before Modern Horizons 2 and definitely before Modern Horizons 1, but I think it's, the games are all really dynamic and interesting. I think that there's not a lot of matchups that aren't fun to play at the good deck versus good deck level. So,
yep.
I think it's great.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Get at it.
Yeah, it's a good time. If you want to follow us, you can find Abe on Twitter at More No Things. You can find me on Twitter at Mason E. Clark. You can find me each and every week here with Abe on the podcast. You can find me on cardkingdom.com writing up stuff for them. Articles, standard, historic, all the good jazz. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Constructive Criticism. If you want to support us, you can go to patreon.com/ccmtg. We'll see you all next week for our penultimate, probably standard episode, because by the time next week rolls around, Abe, as I've been mentioning every week, we get to see our first Crimson Vow cards, baby. We're 3 weeks away. Time flies. He Death of the Universe. Okay, bye.